dark secrets, untold stories, and crimes that shook the nation, all uncovered here. Every chapter exposes the truth behind the shadows of history. Stay with us as we reveal terror, courage, and justice like never before. Subscribe now. Don't miss a single shocking moment of history's hidden crimes.
The pounding on the door came after midnight. It was not a normal knock. It was heavy, angry, demanding. A freed black farmer in rural Georgia froze as his children began to cry. His wife grabbed his arm. Outside, horses stomped in the dirt. Men whispered. Then came the shouting. "Come out!" The door burst open. Men dressed in white robes and hoods flooded into the small wooden house. Some carried guns, some carried whips. They dragged the man outside into the cold night air. His children screamed as the masked riders accused him of voting. Voting. That was his crime. Minutes later, he was left beaten in the dirt. The riders disappeared into the darkness as quickly as they came. But this time, something was different. This time, neighbors saw their faces, and within weeks, arrests would follow. But who were these masked men, and how did terror become so organized so fast? To understand that night, we have to go back to the end of the Civil War. The year was 1865. The Confederacy had fallen. Slavery had ended. Millions of formerly enslaved people were now free. The United States entered a period called Reconstruction. The federal government tried to rebuild the South and protect the rights of freed black citizens. New laws gave black men the right to vote. Some were elected to public office. Schools opened. Churches grew stronger. For the first time, many black families owned land and built homes without fear of being sold. But not everyone accepted this change. In Pulaski, Tennessee, 6 former Confederate officers formed a secret club in late 1865. At first, it was described as a social group. They created strange rituals and costumes. They called themselves the Ku Klux Klan. The name sounded mysterious. The costumes were white robes and tall, pointed hoods. Some members said the white cloth made them look like ghosts of Confederate soldiers. But the club did not stay harmless for long. By 1867 and 1868, local branches of the Klan began spreading across Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and the Carolinas. They did not just meet in secret, they rode at night. They targeted freed black citizens who voted, owned land, or spoke up for their rights. They also targeted white Republicans and teachers who supported Reconstruction. Their goal was simple: use fear to control elections, use violence to silence change. In many counties during the 1868 presidential election, black voters were beaten before they could reach polling stations. Some were warned that they would be killed if they voted again. In Louisiana, masked riders whipped black laborers who tried to negotiate fair wages. In North Carolina, white Republican leaders were dragged from their beds and beaten. Sometimes the attacks ended in death. The violence was not random, it was planned. Riders worked in groups, they carried lists of names. They often knew exactly where their victims lived, and they believed no one would stop them. At first, local law enforcement often looked the other way. Some sheriffs were sympathetic, some were afraid, others were Klan members themselves. But by 1868 and 1869, reports of violence grew too large to ignore. In parts of South Carolina and Georgia, entire communities lived in fear of nightfall. Families would blow out candles early to avoid being seen. Children were taught to stay silent if they heard horses. Yet something unexpected began happening. Witnesses started talking. In Tennessee, several freedmen identified attackers by voice and body shape.
Dark secrets, untold stories, and crimes that shook the nation, all uncovered here. Every chapter exposes the truth behind the shadows of history. Stay with us as we reveal terror, courage, and justice like never before. Subscribe now. Don't miss a single shocking moment of history's hidden crimes.
The pounding on the door came after midnight. It was not a normal knock. It was heavy, angry, demanding. A freed black farmer in rural Georgia froze as his children began to cry. His wife grabbed his arm. Outside, horses stomped in the dirt. Men whispered. Then came the shouting. "Come out!" The door burst open. Men dressed in white robes and hoods flooded into the small wooden house. Some carried guns, some carried whips. They dragged the man outside into the cold night air. His children screamed as the masked riders accused him of voting. Voting. That was his crime. Minutes later, he was left beaten in the dirt. The riders disappeared into the darkness as quickly as they came. But this time, something was different. This time, neighbors saw their faces, and within weeks, arrests would follow. But who were these masked men, and how did terror become so organized so fast? To understand that night, we have to go back to the end of the Civil War. The year was 1865. The Confederacy had fallen. Slavery had ended. Millions of formerly enslaved people were now free. The United States entered a period called Reconstruction. The federal government tried to rebuild the South and protect the rights of freed black citizens. New laws gave black men the right to vote. Some were elected to public office. Schools opened. Churches grew stronger. For the first time, many black families owned land and built homes without fear of being sold. But not everyone accepted this change. In Pulaski, Tennessee, 6 former Confederate officers formed a secret club in late 1865. At first, it was described as a social group. They created strange rituals and costumes. They called themselves the Ku Klux Klan. The name sounded mysterious. The costumes were white robes and tall, pointed hoods. Some members said the white cloth made them look like ghosts of Confederate soldiers. But the club did not stay harmless for long. By 1867 and 1868, local branches of the Klan began spreading across Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and the Carolinas. They did not just meet in secret, they rode at night. They targeted freed black citizens who voted, owned land, or spoke up for their rights. They also targeted white Republicans and teachers who supported Reconstruction. Their goal was simple: use fear to control elections, use violence to silence change. In many counties during the 1868 presidential election, black voters were beaten before they could reach polling stations. Some were warned that they would be killed if they voted again. In Louisiana, masked riders whipped black laborers who tried to negotiate fair wages. In North Carolina, white Republican leaders were dragged from their beds and beaten. Sometimes the attacks ended in death. The violence was not random, it was planned. Riders worked in groups, they carried lists of names. They often knew exactly where their victims lived, and they believed no one would stop them. At first, local law enforcement often looked the other way. Some sheriffs were sympathetic, some were afraid, others were Klan members themselves. But by 1868 and 1869, reports of violence grew too large to ignore. In parts of South Carolina and Georgia, entire communities lived in fear of nightfall. Families would blow out candles early to avoid being seen. Children were taught to stay silent if they heard horses. Yet something unexpected began happening. Witnesses started talking. In Tennessee, several freedmen identified attackers by voice and body shape. In North Carolina, white Republican citizens secretly provided names of local Klan leaders to federal officials. And then came one of the most important shifts. State militias were formed to protect voters. Reconstruction governments, backed by federal troops, began organizing armed patrols. Some militia members were black. This made Klan groups even angrier. In 1868, in parts of Alabama and Georgia, clashes erupted between militia units and masked riders. Arrest warrants were issued. For the first time, men accused of wearing the white hood were taken to jail. But proving guilt was difficult. Victims were often too afraid to testify. Many attacks happened at night with masked faces. Defense lawyers claimed mistaken identity. Still, some arrests led to trials. In Tennessee, several suspected Klansmen were charged with assault and conspiracy. In North Carolina,
Local leaders faced indictment for violent intimidation during elections. Newspapers reported on these cases. Some white Southern newspapers defended the accused. Others warned that lawlessness was destroying communities. The nation was watching. In 1868, Ulysses S. Grant was elected president. He promised to protect Reconstruction. He promised to protect citizens from terror. But on the ground, the violence did not stop overnight. In rural South Carolina, armed bands continued attacking black leaders. Churches were burned. Teachers were threatened. One schoolhouse was destroyed after masked men accused it of teaching rebellion. Arrests increased, but convictions remained inconsistent. Some juries refused to convict white defendants accused of attacking black citizens. Others dismissed charges for lack of evidence. This pattern created a dangerous message. Terror might come with risk, but it did not always come with punishment. Yet pressure continued building. Federal officials collected testimonies. Military commanders wrote reports describing organized night riders.
Some estimated thousands of members across multiple states. Communities became divided. Some white citizens quietly opposed the Klan but feared speaking out. Others openly supported them, believing they were defending order. But order built on fear was unstable. By late 1869, violence in certain counties reached alarming levels. In parts of North and South Carolina, entire neighborhoods were under nightly threat. Then came a moment that changed everything. In one southern county, a group of masked riders attacked a well-known black community leader. But this time, federal soldiers were nearby. The attackers were chased. Several were captured, and for the first time, detailed confessions began to surface. Names were revealed. Oaths were described. Secret meetings were exposed. The White Hood was no longer fully hidden. But what those confessions uncovered would shake the country even more. Because the violence was not just local, it was organized and far bigger than anyone wanted to admit. As Chapter 1 closes, the arrests are growing. Fear is spreading. Secrets are beginning to crack open. But the real question remains, will justice finally break the Klan's power, or will the terror grow even stronger? In the next chapter, the investigations deepen, the testimonies become public, and the fight between federal power and organized terror reaches a breaking point. The Night Riders are no longer invisible, and America is about to confront what has been hiding in plain sight. The jail door slammed shut. Inside the small county cell, 3 white men sat in silence. Just weeks earlier, they had ridden through the countryside at night wearing white robes and hoods. Now their disguises were gone. Their names were written on arrest papers. Outside the courthouse, a crowd gathered. Some were angry that the men had been arrested at all. Others were afraid of what might happen next. Whispers moved through the town like wind before a storm. Because these arrests were different. For the first time, former members of the Ku Klux Klan were not just being accused, they were being investigated by federal authorities, and the truth they carried threatened to expose something far larger than a few midnight attacks. But what would they say? And who else would they name? To understand why these arrests mattered so much, we must look at what was happening across the South in 1868 and 1869. Violence had not slowed after the first wave of arrests described earlier. In fact, in some areas, it grew more organized. Groups of masked riders held secret meetings. They created local chapters or cheddars. They took oaths promising loyalty and silence. Some leaders used military-style ranks. Orders were passed quietly from county to county. Their targets were carefully chosen. Black voters, black teachers, white Republicans, anyone seen as supporting Reconstruction. In many counties, the Klan's goal was clear: stop black citizens from voting in elections. The 1868 election had already shown how powerful black voters could be. Their votes helped elect Republican officials in southern states. For those who opposed Reconstruction, that was unacceptable. In rural North Carolina, reports told of masked riders whipping freedmen who tried to buy land. In South Carolina, armed groups attacked political meetings. In Georgia, Republican leaders were beaten and left unconscious on their own doorsteps. These were not random crimes. They were political violence, and the federal government was starting to notice a pattern. Military officers stationed in the South sent letters to Washington describing organized night raids. Some officers wrote that entire counties were under secret rule. Victims began giving testimony. One freedman described how men in white robes called him by name before dragging him from his home. Another said his attackers warned him never to vote again. A white school teacher reported that masked riders burned her classroom and threatened to kill her if she continued teaching black children. These stories were powerful, but they were also dangerous, because speaking out could bring more violence. Despite the fear, some witnesses stepped forward. In 1869, several suspected Klansmen were arrested in Tennessee after a violent assault on a black community leader. During questioning, cracks began to form. One man admitted he had joined a local Klan group. He described secret signals and meeting places in wooded areas. He claimed their leaders told them the organization was spreading across multiple states. Other detainees denied everything. They said they were being falsely accused. They claimed the Klan did not exist as a real organization. Some insisted the white robes were nothing more than costumes worn for pranks. But investigators were no longer convinced. In some towns, federal officials worked with state militias to collect weapons believed to be used in night raids. Arrest records began to show repeated names. Still, convictions were rare. Local juries often refused to convict white defendants accused of attacking black citizens. Defense lawyers argued that there was not enough proof. Witnesses sometimes withdrew their statements out of fear. This created a strange rhythm: arrest, release, intimidation, silence. And then the violence would return. But something else was happening beneath the surface. The arrests were sending a message. For years, many Klan members believed they were untouchable. They operated under masks and darkness. Now, daylight investigations were forcing them to defend themselves in open court. This shift created tension within the organization. Some members argued that the violence was bringing too much attention. Others wanted to escalate, believing fear was their strongest weapon. In parts of Alabama and South Carolina, violence spiked again in late 1869. Armed riders attacked political gatherings just weeks before local elections. Several community leaders were injured. Federal officials faced a growing problem. If arrests alone did not stop the terror, what would? President Ulysses S. Grant, now in office, watched reports arrive from southern states. He believed Reconstruction must be protected, but federal power had limits. Troops could not be stationed in every town. Meanwhile, newspapers across the country began reporting on masked outrages. Northern papers described the Klan as a secret terrorist group. Some Southern papers dismissed the stories as exaggerations. The country was divided not only by violence, but by belief. Did the Klan truly operate as a national terror network, or were these isolated local crimes? The answer was slowly becoming clearer. In one shocking case in North Carolina, a group of masked riders attacked a county official known for registering black voters. He survived and identified several attackers by voice. Arrests followed quickly. But before trial could begin, threats spread through the community. Witnesses were warned not to testify. Anonymous notes were left on doors. Shots were fired into the homes of known Republicans. Fear returned. Yet this time, federal investigators refused to back down. They gathered sworn statements. They mapped out connections between different local groups. Patterns of leadership began to emerge. What they found was alarming. The Klan was not just a loose collection of angry men. It had symbols, passwords, rituals, and shared goals. It moved with coordination across state lines, and its main weapon was fear. By the end of 1869, Dozens of suspected members had been arrested in scattered counties across the South. Some were charged with assault, others with conspiracy. A few faced serious felony charges, but the larger organization still existed. Arrests had exposed parts of the network. They had not destroyed it. As winter approached, tension grew heavier. Black communities remained on alert after sunset. Some organized self-defense groups. Churches doubled as safe meeting places. White Republican leaders traveled with armed escorts. The South was not at peace. It was balancing between law and terror. And then came another turning point. In a small southern town, federal troops were ordered to protect a political rally. As night fell, masked riders approached the edge of town. This time, they were met with soldiers. Gunfire erupted in the darkness. When the smoke cleared, several riders lay wounded. Others fled into the woods. Captured men were brought into custody, and for the first time, authorities believed they had enough evidence to prove the Klan was a coordinated conspiracy. But proving conspiracy in court would require something powerful. It would require testimony that could not be denied. And someone inside the organization was about to speak. As Chapter 2 ends, the arrests are growing stronger. The investigations are deeper. The masks are slipping. But the biggest battle has not yet been fought. In the next chapter, the federal government will face a choice that could change the future of Reconstruction. Will the law finally overpower organized terror, or will fear once again silence justice? The answer is coming.
The courtroom was silent. Every bench was filled. Soldiers stood along the walls. Outside, a crowd waited in tense quiet, unsure whether justice or chaos would walk out of the doors that day. At the center of the room sat a man who once rode at night under a white hood. Now he was about to speak. When he stood, people leaned forward. Some expected denial, others expected silence. Instead, his voice shook as he began describing secret meetings held in barns and forests, the oaths sworn in darkness, and orders given before midnight rides. He named names. Gasps spread through the courtroom. For the first time, a former member openly described how the Ku Klux Klan operated from the inside. He explained how leaders selected targets, how members disguised their voices, and how violence was meant to frighten entire communities into obedience. The mask was finally coming off. But what would happen when the truth reached the rest of the country? By late 1869, federal investigations into Klan violence had grown more serious than ever before. Reports collected from Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia painted a clear picture. Night attacks were not isolated crimes. They were organized campaigns meant to control political power during Reconstruction. Witness testimony described patterns repeated across states. Riders traveled in groups, leaders issued instructions, victims were chosen because they voted, taught school, or worked with Reconstruction governments. Investigators realized something important. Fear itself was the weapon. Many victims were not killed. They were beaten, threatened, or publicly humiliated. The goal was to send a warning that would spread faster than violence alone. And for a long time, it worked. Families stopped attending political meetings. Some voters stayed home during elections. Teachers left towns after receiving threats. Entire communities lived according to the rhythm of nightfall. But the growing investigations were changing that rhythm. Federal officials began collecting sworn statements in greater numbers. Military officers protected witnesses traveling to testify. Some local leaders who once stayed silent began cooperating with investigators. The testimonies revealed shocking details. Members described costumes stored in hidden locations, passwords used to recognize fellow riders, signals made by knocking or whistling before meetings began.
They also described fear within the organization itself. Some members joined because neighbors pressured them. Others feared becoming targets if they refused. A few admitted they believed the violence had gone too far, but did not know how to leave safely. The Klan's power depended on secrecy, and secrecy was beginning to collapse. Newspapers in northern cities printed detailed accounts of hearings and arrests. Readers who had never seen Reconstruction violence now learned about midnight raids and intimidation. Public opinion began to shift. Many Americans demanded stronger federal action to protect citizens. Others argued the government was interfering too much in Southern affairs. The nation remained divided. Meanwhile, trials moved forward slowly. In several cases, defendants were convicted of assault or conspiracy. Some received prison sentences. Others paid fines or were released due to insufficient evidence. Justice was uneven, but something deeper was changing. The idea that masked violence could operate without consequence was weakening. In some counties, Klan activity decreased after arrests. Night rides became less frequent where federal troops remained nearby. Communities cautiously returned to public meetings and church gatherings. Yet danger still lingered. In early winter, a witness who had testified against local rioters reported threats against his family. Guards were placed outside his home. Fear had not disappeared, it had simply moved into the open. Federal leaders now faced a critical decision. Were arrests enough? Or did the government need stronger laws to stop organized terror completely? The evidence collected during 1868 and 1869 convinced many officials that existing laws were not strong enough. Local courts alone could not handle crimes tied to secret organizations operating across counties and states. Discussions began in Washington about new enforcement powers. The investigations of these early years laid the foundation for future federal action against the Klan. Lawmakers debated how to protect voting rights and punish conspiracies designed to intimidate citizens. The events of these years proved one thing clearly. Reconstruction was not only a political struggle, it was a battle over safety, justice, and the meaning of freedom after the Civil War. Back in the courtroom, the witness finished speaking. The room remained still as jurors absorbed what they had heard. Outside, people waited for a verdict that represented more than one case. It represented whether the law could stand against organized fear. When the decision finally came, reactions were mixed. Some celebrated accountability, others called it injustice. But the trial marked a turning point. The White Hood no longer guaranteed anonymity. Across parts of the South, membership began to decline as arrests and exposure increased. Some local groups dissolved quietly. Others attempted to reorganize under different names. The violence did not disappear overnight, but the illusion of invisibility had been broken. Families who once hid at night slowly reopened schools and churches. Political meetings resumed under guard. Reconstruction governments continued struggling to protect citizens while facing resistance. The story of 1868 to 1869 became one of confrontation. A secret terror group had risen quickly in the chaos after war. Communities had suffered under fear, and step by step, investigations and arrests began pushing back against that fear. Yet history would show that the fight was far from over. The ideas behind the violence would resurface in later decades, reminding the nation how fragile justice can be when fear spreads unchecked. As this documentary closes, one question remains for every generation that follows. What happens when ordinary people choose silence instead of courage? And what changes when witnesses decide to speak? The early arrests of the Ku Klux Klan did not end terror completely,
but they proved something powerful. Even organizations built on secrecy can be challenged when truth steps into the light. And the voices that once trembled in fear became the voices that exposed the Night Riders. The door of the courtroom opened. People stepped into the daylight. For the first time in years, some believed the night no longer belonged to the masks. The Night Riders returned. Just when some towns believed the terror was fading, hoofbeats echoed again through dark country roads. A cross was burned in an open field. A warning letter was nailed to a church door. The arrests of 1868 and 1869 had shaken the Ku Klux Klan. Trials had exposed secrets. Members had been jailed. But now whispers spread that the organization was trying to rebuild in hidden ways. Had justice truly won, or had it only slowed the storm? In several southern counties, investigators noticed something troubling. The white robes were seen less often. Public violence decreased in areas with federal patrols, but threats continued quietly. Men who once rode in groups began acting alone or in smaller numbers. Instead of large midnight raids, there were sudden beatings on lonely roads. Instead of public intimidation, there were private warnings. The strategy was changing. In South Carolina and Mississippi, reports described secret meetings held without costumes. Leaders instructed members to avoid attention. They were told to deny anything if questioned. The early arrests had taught them a lesson. Visibility brought danger. At the same time, political tension remained high. Local Reconstruction governments struggled with limited resources. Federal troops could not stay everywhere forever. Many northern citizens grew tired of sending soldiers south. Some asked why the conflict had not ended after the Civil War. But for black families in the South, the war for safety never truly stopped. In small towns, freedmen continued organizing churches and schools. Teachers returned despite past threats. Voter registration efforts resumed under protection. Yet fear lingered like a shadow. One evening in early 1870, a black community leader who had testified against local riders received another warning. A note left at his door read only 2 words: "We remember." He reported it to authority.
But no one was arrested. The Klan had learned how to survive pressure. Meanwhile, federal officials in Washington studied reports from the past 2 years. The investigations of 1868 and 1869 made something clear. Local arrests alone were not enough. The Klan operated as a conspiracy. It crossed county and state lines. It targeted constitutional rights, especially voting rights. Stronger federal action was needed. Debates grew louder in Congress. Lawmakers argued about how far the government should go to protect citizens. Some feared expanding federal power. Others believed protecting life and liberty required bold steps. The testimonies gathered during the earlier trials became evidence in these debates. Witnesses had described masked men acting with shared purpose. They described oaths of loyalty and coordinated attacks. These were not random crimes. They were organized terror. The pressure for national laws grew stronger. Communities that had once been silent began sending petitions to Washington asking for protection. Ministers, teachers, and elected officials described the impact of intimidation on daily life. They asked one simple question: if citizens could not vote safely, was freedom real? As the political fight continued, another dramatic arrest took place in North Carolina. A former local Klan organizer was captured after witnesses identified him in connection with multiple assaults. During questioning, he admitted the group had reorganized after the early trials. He described efforts to hide leadership roles and to destroy written records. This confession confirmed what investigators suspected. The Klan
was adapting. But each arrest also created cracks in the organization's unity. Some members feared betrayal. Others worried that informants were inside their ranks. Trust began to weaken. In some counties, membership shrank as fear of prosecution grew. Younger men hesitated to join. Community leaders quietly discouraged involvement. The power of the White Hood depended on confidence, and confidence was fading. By the end of this period, the early wave of exposure had permanently changed how the Klan operated. It could no longer act openly without expecting investigation. Its leaders understood that federal attention could bring serious consequences. For families who endured night raids, the change was not perfect. Violence did not vanish overnight, but there were fewer organized mass attacks in certain regions compared to the height of 1868. The struggle between terror and law had entered a new phase. Instead of unchecked violence, there was now resistance backed by investigation. Instead of silence, there were records, testimonies, and arrests. The story of these years became more than a list of crimes. It became a lesson in how organized fear can grow in unstable times, and how difficult it is to push it back once it spreads. On a quiet evening months later, the same Georgia family from the opening chapter sat together inside their small home. The father still carried scars from the beating he endured years earlier. But that night, no riders came, no pounding on the door. The children listened to the wind instead of hoofbeats. It was not perfect safety, but it was a fragile step toward peace. The early arrests of 1868 and 1869 had not destroyed the Ku Klux Klan completely, yet they proved something powerful. Secret violence could be exposed. Organized terror could be investigated. Witnesses could stand up, even when afraid. History would show that stronger federal laws soon followed, built on the foundation of these investigations. The struggle against racial terror would continue for decades. But the events of these years marked the first major confrontation between the United States government and the Klan's organized violence. The White Hood promised invisibility. The courtroom proved otherwise. And as this chapter closes, one truth remains clear. When fear rules the night, justice must learn to walk in the dark. The early arrests of 1868 and 1869 remind us that freedom is never automatic. It must be defended again and again, especially when intimidation tries to silence it. The Night Riders believed darkness would protect them, but history remembers their names. The message reached Washington like a warning bell. Reports from the South described night riders still moving through rural counties. Witnesses were threatened. Local courts struggled. Some juries refused to convict. Federal investigators warned that the violence was organized and designed to destroy voting rights. President Ulysses S. Grant read the reports carefully. He had been a Union general. He understood organized force, and he recognized something dangerous. This was not random crime. This was coordinated intimidation meant to overturn Reconstruction. If it continued, the rights promised after the Civil War would exist only on paper. And so, the federal government prepared to act. By 1870, lawmakers in Congress debated new ways to stop secret terror groups. Testimony from earlier arrests in 1868 and 1869 showed that local laws were not strong enough. The Ku Klux Klan operated across state lines. Members used disguises. They intimidated witnesses before trials. To defeat something organized, the law had to become organized too. In 1870, Congress passed the first Enforcement Act. This law made it a federal crime to interfere with a citizen's right to vote. it allowed federal authorities, not just local courts, to prosecute cases where rights were denied. For the first time, the national government directly targeted organized intimidation. But passing a law and enforcing it were two different things. In parts of South Carolina, violence flared again. Armed rioters attacked black citizens who attempted to organize politically. Reports described whippings, gunfire, and threats delivered under cover of darkness. Federal investigators began building cases carefully. Investigators traveled county to county, collecting sworn statements. Military officers protected witnesses. Some former Klan members agreed to testify in exchange for lighter punishment. The network slowly came into focus. Secret dens, local leaders, shared passwords, coordinated attacks. By 1871, Congress passed an even stronger law known as the Ku Klux Klan Act. This law allowed the president to use federal troops against conspiracies that deprived citizens of their rights. It also allowed federal courts to prosecute crimes when local courts failed. And Ulysses S. Grant now had authority to take direct action. And he did. In parts of South Carolina, where Klan activity was especially violent, federal troops were deployed. Habeas corpus, the legal protection against unlawful detention, was temporarily suspended in certain counties to allow authorities to arrest suspected conspirators quickly. Mass arrests followed. Hundreds of suspected Klan members were detained. Some fled the area, others surrendered. Weapons were confiscated. Secret documents were seized. For the first time, organized terror faced a coordinated national response. Inside federal courtrooms, trials began that drew national attention. Witnesses described night raids in detail. They told juries about masked men breaking into homes, beating victims, and warning them never to vote again. Some defendants pleaded guilty, others denied involvement. Convictions followed in multiple cases. Prison sentences were handed down. The impact was immediate. In counties where federal enforcement was strong, Klan activity dropped sharply. Night rides became rare. Political meetings resumed without constant fear. But the crackdown was not simple. Many white citizens accused the federal government of overreach. Some newspapers criticized the suspension of habeas corpus. Political opponents argued that Washington was interfering in Southern affairs. The nation once again stood divided. Yet, for many black families who had endured years of intimidation, the presence of federal protection felt like a shield. One South Carolina community reported that for the first time in years, church services were held without armed guards at the door. Schools reopened with fewer threats. Voter registration increased. The change did not erase the past. Scars remained. Some victims carried lifelong injuries from earlier attacks. Others mourned loved ones lost during violent raids. But the
balance of power had shifted. The White Hood no longer guaranteed safety from the law. The early arrests of 1868 and 1869 had cracked open the secret world of the Klan. The Enforcement Acts turned those cracks into open confrontation. Membership in many areas declined sharply after the federal crackdown. Leaders went into hiding. Some groups dissolved quietly to avoid prosecution. Yet even as visible activity decreased, the ideas behind the violence did not disappear completely. Prejudice and resistance to Reconstruction remained in parts of the South. Some former members waited for political winds to change. History would later show that the Klan would reappear in different forms in future decades. But during this moment, federal action had delivered a powerful message. Organized terror would not operate without consequence. As this chapter closes, Picture a quiet southern town in late 1871. The roads are still. The air is heavy with memory. Families sit inside their homes, listening to the night. But no hoofbeats come. No pounding on the door. For the first time in years, silence does not mean fear. It means protection. Yet a question remains as the federal crackdown continues. Will this peace last? Or will the forces of hatred simply wait for another moment to rise again? In the final chapter, we will examine the aftermath of the crackdown, the long-term effects on Reconstruction, and what these early battles against the Ku Klux Klan teach us about justice, courage, and the fragile nature of freedom. The struggle is not over. It is entering its final test. The courtroom was silent when the verdict was read. A former night rider stood stiff as the judge spoke his sentence. Federal marshals waited at the doors. Reporters leaned forward with their pens ready. Outside, a small crowd gathered, unsure whether to cheer or stay quiet. Guilty. The word felt heavy in the room. For years, men had hidden behind white robes in darkness. They believed no court would ever touch them. But now, in 1871 and 1872, federal trials were sending a different message. The law had reached into the shadows. And for a moment, it seemed like justice was finally winning. But even as convictions were handed down, something else was happening quietly across the South. The robes were disappearing. Not because hatred had ended, but because the organization was changing. After the Enforcement Acts and the Ku Klux Klan Act, hundreds of suspected members were arrested. Some served prison time, others paid heavy fines. Some fled their counties. Federal troops remained stationed in troubled areas, watching closely. Public Klan activity sharply declined. In counties once filled with midnight raids, nights grew calmer. Political meetings happened with less fear. Black citizens voted in greater numbers again. Churches and schools reopened without constant threats. For families who had lived through terror, the silence felt almost unreal. But peace can be fragile. Behind closed doors, resentment simmered. Some white citizens believed the federal government had humiliated them. They called the arrests political punishment. Newspapers in certain areas accused Washington of using military power to control the South. The anger did not vanish. It simply changed shape. Instead of wearing white robes and riding openly at night, some former members moved into local politics. They joined new groups with different names. They used speeches and laws instead of whips and masks. Violence did not disappear completely either. In some regions, smaller attacks continued. They were less organized, but still meant to frighten voters. Without the large structure of the early Klan, these acts were harder to trace back to a central command. The original wave of organized terror from 1868 to 1869 had been broken, but the ideas behind it survived. President Grant's crackdown worked in the short term. By 1872, federal reports showed a clear drop in coordinated Klan violence. Many of the original dens had dissolved. Leaders were in prison, hiding, or publicly denying involvement. Historians later called this the first Klan collapse. Yet Reconstruction itself was under pressure. Northern support began to weaken. Economic problems hit the country in 1873 with a financial panic. Attention shifted to jobs, banks, and money. The urgency that once drove Congress to pass enforcement acts began to fade. And as federal focus weakened, local resistance slowly strengthened again. By the mid-1870s, new political groups in the South gained control of state governments. Some of these leaders promised order and unity, but they also supported laws that limited black political power in quiet ways.
The battle was no longer about night raids alone. It became a struggle over voting rules, jury service, and public offices. The early arrests of 1868 and 1869 had shown that the federal government could act. Chapter 6 showed how strong that action became. But Chapter 7 reveals a harder truth. Law enforcement can stop violence. It cannot instantly erase belief. Many of the men arrested during the crackdown later returned home after serving sentences. Some stayed quiet. Others remained active in local affairs. The fear they once spread had changed the political landscape permanently. Communities that had been terrorized carried long memories. Parents warned children about the years when masked riders ruled the night. Survivors told stories about standing firm even when threats came to their doors. Those stories became part of family history. They also became part of American history. The early Klan violence forced the nation to define what freedom truly meant after the Civil War. Was freedom only about ending slavery, or was it also about protecting the right to vote, speak, gather, and live without terror? The Enforcement Acts answered that question clearly. For a time,
Freedom required protection, and protection sometimes required force. But the ending of Reconstruction in 1877 marked another turning point. Federal troops were withdrawn from the South as part of a political compromise. Without that federal presence, Southern states regained more control over their internal affairs. Over the next decades, new laws known as Jim Crow laws would rise, limiting the rights of black citizens again. The white robes of the early Klan faded. Yet racial violence and intimidation did not disappear entirely from American life. In the 1910s, decades later, a second Ku Klux Klan would emerge, inspired in part by the earlier movement. History has echoes. But here is what makes the years 1868 to 1869 so important. That was the moment when organized terror first tried to crush Reconstruction. And that was also the moment when arrests began pulling back the curtain. Men once thought untouchable were named in court. Witnesses once too afraid to speak gave testimony. Federal law stepped in where local systems failed. The prison cells that held convicted night riders were more than punishment. They were symbols. They showed that even secret societies could be challenged. Even masked men could face a judge. Even organized fear could be confronted. As we close this series, imagine standing in a small southern town in 1872. The courthouse doors close for the night. A federal marshal locks the jail. The streets are quiet. Children sleep without listening for hoofbeats. But older generations remain cautious. They know how quickly peace can change. The story of early Ku Klux Klan violence and arrests is not just about crime. It is about a country struggling to rebuild after war. It is about the power of law to confront organized terror. And it is about the limits of that power when political will fades. The arrests of 1868 and 1869 were not the final chapter of racial violence in America, but they were proof that terror could be challenged. That is the legacy of those years. Not perfection, not complete victory, but resistance. And now, as we step back from the past, one final question remains for us today. When fear tries to rise in any form, will justice answer as boldly as it did then? Or will silence once again give shadows room to grow? The night grew quiet after the crackdown, but history reminds us, silence is never the end of the story. The train station was crowded in the early morning light. It was 1877. Federal soldiers stood beside their rail cars, rifles stacked, boots dusty from years of patrol in southern towns. Local residents watched from a distance.
Some faces looked relieved, others looked nervous, a few looked quietly pleased. The soldiers were leaving. For nearly a decade, their presence had been a warning to secret groups who once ruled the night. They had helped enforce arrests, they had guarded courthouses, they had stood outside polling places. Now they were boarding trains north. And as the engine hissed and the wheels began to move, something invisible shifted in the south. The shield was gone. What would happen next? The Compromise of 1877 ended Reconstruction. In exchange for resolving a disputed presidential election, federal troops were withdrawn from southern states. President Grant had once used federal power to crush organized Klan violence. Now that power was fading from daily life in the region. At first, nothing dramatic happened. There were no immediate waves of masked riders, no sudden midnight raids like those in 1868 and 1869. The original Ku Klux Klan had already collapsed years earlier under federal pressure. But the structure that had protected civil rights was weakening. Without federal troops nearby, local governments regained full control over law enforcement. In some areas, the same communities that once resisted Reconstruction now controlled the courts and sheriff's offices again. And this time, the tactics were different. Instead of large secret raids, political power became the new weapon. New laws were passed that slowly limited voting rights. Poll taxes required citizens to pay money before voting. Literacy tests made registration harder. Complex rules discouraged participation. The violence was quieter now, but its goal felt familiar: control. In the late 1870s and 1880s, some former Klan members blended into public life. They became businessmen, farmers, even local officials. The white robes were hidden away, but the beliefs that once fueled organized terror had not disappeared. In some counties, intimidation returned in smaller, less organized forms. Threats were whispered instead of shouted. Jobs were denied. Social pressure replaced open raids. It was harder to prosecute prejudice than it was to prosecute masked assault. Federal enforcement acts still existed on paper, but without strong national will to enforce them, they became tools rarely used. The early arrests of 1868 and 1869 remained powerful memories. Older citizens remembered the shock of seeing night riders dragged into courtrooms. They remembered the fear in the eyes of men who once believed they were untouchable. But younger generations were growing up in a different environment. They did not remember the federal crackdown. They remembered who held power now. Across the South, new political leaders promised home rule. They argued that states should govern themselves without outside interference. Many white voters supported this idea strongly. For black communities, the change brought uncertainty. Church leaders and teachers encouraged education and organization. They built schools, mutual aid societies, and businesses. They worked hard to protect what rights they still had. Courage did not disappear, but it required new forms. Instead of relying on federal troops, communities relied on each other. Some historians later described this period as the quiet turning of the tide. The dramatic terror of the first Klan wave had been crushed, yet the broader fight over equality continued in subtler ways. And then, decades later, something unexpected happened. In 1915, inspired partly by romanticized stories of the past and the film The Birth of a Nation, a second Ku Klux Klan was formed. It claimed connection to the earlier group of the 1860s. The name returned, the robes returned, the symbolism returned, but the world had changed. This new Klan spread beyond the South. It targeted not only Black Americans, but also immigrants, Catholics, and Jews. At its height in the 1920s, it claimed millions of members nationwide.
The shadow from 1868 had stretched forward in time. Yet history also shows something else. Each time the Klan rose, it eventually faced resistance. Journalists exposed corruption inside the organization. Law enforcement prosecuted crimes. Public opinion shifted. Membership declined again.
The cycle revealed a pattern. Organized hate could grow in certain conditions, but it could also be confronted. Looking back to those early years, 1868 and 1869, we see the first major test of how the United States would respond to domestic terror after the Civil War. It was messy, it was incomplete, but it mattered. The arrests showed that the federal government could act when local systems failed. The enforcement acts set legal precedents that would influence civil rights law in the future. Decades later, during the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, federal authorities would once again step in to protect voting rights and confront violent resistance. The blueprint had roots in Reconstruction. The story that began with masked riders pounding on doors ended up shaping national law for generations. And so we return to that silent southern road in 1868. The sound of hoofbeats in the dark, the terror inside small wooden homes, the belief that no one would stop the riders. Then we remember the courtroom verdicts, the federal troops, the prison cells closing behind convicted men, the idea that even powerful secret groups could face consequences. History is not a straight line. It rises, it falls, it circles back. The early Ku Klux Klan violence and arrests were not the end of racial conflict in America, but they were proof of something important. Justice can push back, even when fear seems stronger. As we close this final chapter of the extended series, imagine standing in that train station in 1877 again. The soldiers are gone. The platform is quiet. The future feels uncertain. What happens next depends not just on laws, but on people, on courage, on memory, on whether communities choose silence or resistance. The first Ku Klux Klan believed fear would silence a nation. For a time, it did not. And that is why the story of 1868 to 1869 still matters today. Because every generation faces its own version of the question: when darkness rises, who will stand in the light? This is where our journey ends, but the lessons remain. The wind blew cold through the streets of Charleston. It was 1880, more than a decade after the first arrests of the Ku Klux Klan in 1868 and 1869. The masks were gone. The robes hung in closets, hidden away. Yet whispers of fear still moved through some neighborhoods. Families who had lived under the shadow of midnight riders remembered every knock, every threat, every warning. Some stories were told around the fire. Others were never spoken aloud, kept in silence to avoid attention. The victims, teachers, ministers, black voters, and community leaders carried scars that no law could fully erase. Some had been beaten. Some had lost loved ones. Some had lost property, farms, or livelihoods to masked attacks. And yet, amidst this pain, courage endured. Communities rebuilt. Churches became safe havens. Schools reopened. Families worked to reclaim the rights and freedoms that had been violently threatened. Survivors organized mutual aid societies, sharing resources and knowledge. They taught the next generation to vote, to speak, to stand tall, even when shadows lurked nearby. But the country itself had learned a lesson too.
Federal law, once passive in the face of domestic terror, had demonstrated it could act. The arrests, prosecutions, and military interventions of 1868 to 1872 became a blueprint. Enforcement acts proved that organized violence could be met with force, that witnesses could be protected, and that conspiracies hiding behind secrecy could be exposed. Yet the Klan's ideas survived. Through subtle political pressures, social intimidation, and covert operations, resistance to Reconstruction persisted. Even as visible night rides ceased, a culture of fear and exclusion lingered, shaping local governments, voter access, and public opinion. The battle between justice and terror became less about visible violence and more about the structures of power. The echoes of 1868 carried forward. Decades later, when a second Klan arose in the early 20th century, it drew inspiration from those early acts of terror, but it also faced the lessons of failure. Federal intervention, public exposure, and legal consequences had already shown that organized hate could be challenged. The story of the first Klan arrests became a historical reference point, a warning and a guide for future resistance against domestic terrorism. For the families who had endured, the story was personal. They remembered the terror and the arrests, the nights of fear, and the rare moments of relief when federal troops stood guard. They remembered the power of testimony, the courage of neighbors who refused to remain silent, and the slow but tangible impact of law when enforced consistently. These memories became family histories, shaping how generations understood courage, justice, and the cost of freedom. History, after all, is not just about events. It is about lessons learned, about choices made under pressure, about fear confronted with bravery. The early Ku Klux Klan violence and arrests of 1868 to 1869 were more than a chapter in Reconstruction. They were a defining moment in America's ongoing struggle to balance freedom, justice, and the rule of law. And the question remains for every generation: when darkness rises, will you stand in the light or step aside and let fear take hold? The night has passed, but the echoes remain. The letters arrived quietly at the small post office in Columbia, South Carolina. They were unsigned, written in careful script, warning local leaders to mind their place and remember the night. No one claimed them, but everyone understood. Even years after the federal crackdown, fear had not completely disappeared. The original Ku Klux Klan wave of terror in 1868 to 1869 had been broken, but the memory of it lingered like a shadow across the South. In some towns, parents still warned children not to walk alone after dark. Ministers spoke cautiously from the pulpit. Teachers moved carefully between classrooms, wary of strangers in the night. The scars of the early Klan violence were not just physical, they were psychological, woven into the rhythm of daily life. And yet, quietly, some began to push back. Former victims, community leaders, and even a few ex-Klan members began speaking out. They shared their experiences, describing the threats, the attacks, and the arrests. These narratives appeared in newspapers in Charleston, Raleigh, and Atlanta. These narratives reminded people that terror could be challenged, that even the most organized fear could face consequences. Federal authorities, although less present than in the early 1970s, remained vigilant. They monitored reports of secret societies and intimidation. Arrests were rarer now, but the knowledge that law could reach into the shadows continued to act as a deterrent. In the quiet of one southern county, a former night rider reflected on the past. He remembered the thrill of power, the fear he could inspire, and the secrecy that once shielded him. But he also remembered the arrests, the courtrooms, the federal marshals, and the prison cells that stripped that power away. The lesson was clear. Fear can dominate a night, but law and courage can dominate history. The echoes of 1868 now were not just stories of terror, they were warnings, lessons, and memories.
Even as the South continued to rebuild, one question haunted communities. How long could peace last when the seeds of fear had been sown so deeply? And somewhere in the quiet of the night, the sound of distant hoofbeats, or perhaps just memory, reminded them that vigilance was never optional. The struggle between law, fear, and freedom continued, and every choice mattered. The story was far from over. The courthouse doors opened one last time. It was 1885, and the South had changed, but not completely. The shadows of 1868 and 1869 still lingered in whispers, warnings, and memories. People remembered the night riders, the attacks, and the fear that once ruled entire counties. But they also remembered the arrests, the courtrooms, and the courage it took to speak the truth. Federal troops were gone, and Reconstruction had officially ended years before. Yet the lessons of those early arrests remained etched into the region's history. Families shared stories with children, teaching them to be brave, to testify if threatened, and to protect their communities. The first wave of Klan arrests had proved that even the most secretive organizations could be exposed, and that justice could reach those who hid behind masks and fear. In some towns, the quiet streets were a victory. Children walked to school safely. Churches reopened without guards. Political meetings continued, though vigilance remained necessary. Survivors understood that freedom was fragile and that courage often required sacrifice. But the story also carried a warning. History would show that prejudice, hatred, and intimidation could rise again in new forms. The second Ku Klux Klan would emerge decades later, inspired by the memory of the original. Organized terror could be defeated, but it could also return if society turned a blind eye. The legacy of 1868 to 1869 and the arrests that followed was clear. Fear can be confronted, darkness can be challenged, and the law, when enforced, can protect the vulnerable. Yet freedom demands vigilance, courage, and action from every generation. As the sun set over the South, families remembered. Survivors passed down their stories, communities rebuilt, and the night, once ruled by masks, remained a reminder. Justice may falter, terror may rise, but truth, courage, and resilience endure. The story ends here, but the lessons live on. The story doesn't end here. More dark truths are waiting to be uncovered. If you want to witness the secrets, the terror, and the fight for justice, stay with us. Hit subscribe and join the journey into history's most chilling crimes. Turn on notifications because the next story could shock you even more.